Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the first MyCore Spring webinar. My name is Jo Lattimore, and I am the director of the Michigan Clean Water Corps, or MyCore, Michigan statewide lake and stream volunteer monitoring program. We're starting out with an instruction slide here. A couple of key things to keep in mind is that you will be muted and you will have your camera off during this presentation. So if you have any questions for our presenter today, please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen to click there and type your questions. You can type those questions at any time during today's webinar, and we'll have a Q&A session after the presentation. Currently, the chat function is disabled. We want your questions in the Q&A box and not under chat. So we have the chat area disabled for now. We will reactivate it when we get to the discussion part. So if you have something you'd like to say that isn't a specific question for our speaker, you're welcome to share it in the chat at that time. So we'll kick off with a quick introduction to MyCore, and then we'll transition into our presentation. Next slide, please.
Not moving forward. Just a moment, please.
All right, so the Michigan Clean Water Corps is Michigan's volunteer lake and stream monitoring program. And we have three key programs that make up this initiative across Michigan. One is our volunteer stream monitoring program that engages volunteers across the state in collecting invertebrates, insects, from streams to better understand their health and assess their habitat quality. Next slide. We also have a volunteer stream cleanup program that we support, where local governments can apply for funding to host stream cleanup events to remove trash and garbage from the streams and rivers in their communities. And currently we are accepting grant applications for both our stream monitoring program and our stream cleanup program. And you can visit our website for more information on that. Next slide. And the third and final component of MyCore is the Cooperative Lakes Monitoring Program. This is our statewide lake monitoring program, where folks around the state monitor more than 300 lakes across Michigan every year for water quality, invasive species, and much more. Regardless of whether your interest is streams or lakes, we have a program for you. Next slide, please. You can learn more about the MyCore program at mycore.net. MyCore is a program of the Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes and Energy, MSU Extension, the Huron River Watershed Council, and Michigan Lakes and Streams Association. Now, with no further ado, I'm excited to introduce our main event, the reason that you're all here. I'd like to introduce Danielle Matuszak. She is a master's student in the Department of Fisheries and Wildlife at Michigan State University. She works in the data-intensive landscape limnology lab, where her major advisor is Dr. Kendra Sharavello. And if any of you were able to join us for the last Michigan Inland Lakes Partnership Conference back in 2020, Dr. Sharavello was one of our keynote speakers that I know a lot of you enjoyed seeing. And I know Danielle's going to tell us a little bit about herself and her background. So I'm going to hand the screen and the microphone over to you.
Thank you, Jo, for such a nice introduction. So as Jo mentioned, I'll be presenting on freshwater mussels. As you guys saw when you registered, the title of this presentation is Nice Mussels, the importance of freshwater mussels in lake and stream ecosystems. And so to give a brief overview of kind of who I am, my research, and my passions for science. So I got my bachelor's degree in science at St. Norbert College in De Pere, Wisconsin, in environmental science, where I had the good fortune to be able to work for several different research labs, as well as spend a summer working for UW-Madison's Trout Lake Field Station in northern Wisconsin, where 3 of these photos are from. While I was an undergrad, I was able to work with outreach, doing the pool photo there in the upper right shows me interacting with the public for Trout Lake Station, doing outreach, educating the public about different invertebrates that are found in the lakes and streams surrounding this station. I also have helped with freshwater mussel surveys here in Michigan, And I've also done individual projects while I was up at Trout Lake and did a undergraduate senior thesis on the impacts of PCB dredging in the Fox River in Green Bay, Wisconsin on macroinvertebrate populations. And so as Joe mentioned, I'm currently a master's student. I anticipate defending my research and my thesis this coming May, which is exciting with that deadline coming up. And so I am getting a dual degree in fisheries and wildlife, as well as in ecology, evolution, and behavior right here at MSU in East Lansing. And to go a little bit about my research interests, my specific thesis research involves the biogeography of zebra mussels in the United States. And so zebra mussels are invasive species, and I'll touch on that a little bit towards the end of this presentation. And then also I'm very passionate about outreach and engagement, as is evidenced by being one of the key people putting on this webinar series and doing research, outreach and engagement from research and such in the past. And then broadly, conservation biology is a passion of mine. I believe that we need to conserve and protect our natural waterways and landscapes for future generations and for the organisms that call them home. And so to start off, I'm just going to give a brief overview of kind of the three main topics that I'm going to be discussing today in this presentation. The first is the general biology of freshwater mussels. I'll give an introduction to their life cycle, where you can find them with their habitat, those kinds of things. And then I'm going to follow up with the threats to those native freshwater mussels. Unfortunately, native mussels are quite threatened in North America and in Michigan. And so I'll go over a couple of the things that are threatening those native mussel populations. And finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about the conservation of freshwater mussels and what the United States and Michigan is doing to conserve and protect our existing freshwater mussels, as well as potentially introducing freshwater mussels back into areas where they previously weren't. So to start off, as I mentioned, I'll start with the biology of freshwater mussels. Freshwater bivalves, freshwater mussels, are very common throughout the world and in North America. There is an estimate of about 300 species in North America alone, which makes up over a third of the species worldwide. So North America has quite a high diversity of freshwater mussels. And Michigan alone has over 14% of those American mussel species. So you're able to find upwards of 43 different mussel species throughout the Upper Peninsula and Lower Michigan, which is incredible since it has such a wide diversity for just one state. And one thing that is quite interesting and I find fascinating about freshwater mussels is their life cycle. Many people may not know this, but freshwater mussels actually have a parasitic phase. And so I'll quick walk through their life cycle, but that parasitic phase is key to their survival. So the way this goes, it starts out with male and female mussels. The male will release gametes into the water, into the female, where the female will fertilize internally and brood for about 2 to 11 months. Once that brooding period is over, those larvae are becoming a parasitic larvae called Glochidia. When they have reached that parasitic phase, the females will release those larvae into the water where they need to attach to a host fish. This is that key parasitic phase. Many species of freshwater mussels require specific species of host fish for them to attach to and live in the gills of in order to reach their juvenile stage. Once a parasitic larvae, the Glochidia, have attached to a host fish, metamorphosis occurs where they go from that larvae into a juvenile mussel. Once they reach a certain size and a certain stage in that juvenile, they will fall off the fish host gills, which will run along the sides there, and they'll drop into the bottom of a stream or lake where they'll nestle down and burrow into the sediment to then mature into an adult mussel. Then, when those adult mussels are mature, the life cycle starts over again, starting with the male releasing the gametes to the female, and so on and so forth. And so when I first was starting to look into research and become familiar with freshwater mussels, I simply assumed that they were just a mussel, they release their gametes into the water, fertilize that way, they drop to the bottom and go. But that's not the case. They actually have a very complex and interesting life cycle with that parasitic phase. And I'll touch on that through a good part of this presentation about the importance of those host fish and that parasitic stage. And so one key thing that I want to emphasize is that the diversity of the freshwater mussels that we have in lakes and streams throughout Michigan, throughout North America, and throughout the world are very much dependent on the diversity of fish in those same ecosystems. And that if a species of mussels does not have its specific host fish in its ecosystem, that can cause their reproduction and the sustaining of that population become quite complicated and may lead to the decline in that population. And I'm going to quick go over a little bit about shell morphology. I won't touch on it too long since it can get quite complex. But when it comes to freshwater mussels, there are 5 kind of main shapes that you can find them in. And you may have seen some of these in your sampling that you have done in the past, or may see them in the future. So we have the round ones, which are evident, they're quite round. And then we have the oval, elongate, which are quite longer and skinny. And then we have the triangular ones, and then rhomboidal. And so these 5 different shapes kind of make up the general population of freshwater mussels. Most freshwater mussels fall into one of those shape categories, and the shape and size are key things when it comes to identifying freshwater mussels. A couple other things of the morphology, you can see the above diagram there shows a couple different identifications. So you have like the beak of the mussel, you have the beak cavity, lateral teeth, ridges, all of these things. And so I won't get too in depth, but these are some of the key areas that you use to identify freshwater mussels, not only their shape, but a lot of their general shell morphology as well. And so, as I said, I'm going to give an overview of their biology, and that includes their habitat. Where do they like to make themselves at home? And so, in general, they like permanent bodies of water. So, if you have a body of water that evaporates during the summer, but then comes back in the spring or in the fall, you won't find mussels there since they do need to stay submerged. However, finding suitable habitat or identifying what a suitable habitat is can be quite difficult to describe, as it can vary greatly between species and between regions within the United States, North America, and worldwide. I have pictured here on the top a rayed bean freshwater mussel, quite little. And on the bottom there, we have a white cat's paw as well, which has that kind of triangular shape. And so these 2 mussels are actually endangered. They're threatened because of habitat loss and many other threats that I'll get into a little bit later. A key thing to note about freshwater mussels is just because there's freshwater mussels in a stream or in a lake doesn't mean you'll be able to find them easily. They are kind of patchy in their distribution, that specific areas within a lake or specific sections of a stream channel or sections of a stream's course may not be suitable, though we can't describe suitable very well for some species. They're patchy. They will go to a specific area or will be in a small subsection of that lake or stream. So surveying them, finding them can sometimes be a little bit difficult. And with habitat, the few things we do kind of know that we need for freshwater mussels to be successful in living in their habitat and maintaining populations is the water needs to contain the essentials, oxygen and calcium. So they need that calcium in order to build their shells, oxygen to survive. And so they also need protection from predators and also habitat for their fish hosts. I said that fish host would come back again. Well, here it is again. If their fish hosts are not able to survive in a section of stream or in the lake, there's a good chance that the population of mussels that are there will eventually die out since they aren't able to reproduce using those host fish with that parasitic phase. The other thing we need is support for the mussel in the form of the substrate. And so this is kind of the Goldilocks. So it needs to be soft enough for burrowing, but firm enough to support. So somewhere in the middle is kind of that Goldilocks thing of the Goldilocks and the 3 bears. So we need it soft enough to burrow in and able to mature for those juveniles, but firm enough to support it that it doesn't sink in or kind of get lost in the muck in the bottom of a stream or a river. And these things go the same for kind of if you're in a stream system of not too fast a flow, but not too slow a flow of the water, not too deep, but not too shallow. The Goldilocks is very common when it comes to discussing mussel habitat. And so, as this title has talked, the importance of freshwater mussels in ecosystems. In many ecosystems, they serve as a food source for a wide variety of other organisms, both organisms that are terrestrial, some that are both aquatic and terrestrial, and just aquatic organisms. So muskrats and otters and raccoons, they will all feed on the adult mussels and sometimes the juveniles as well. Whereas younger mussels are often predated upon by ducks, herons, many fishes. And so I have a couple of those organisms pictured here. On the bottom left, we have ducks. In the middle there, we have a little muskrat, of which I have one living behind my apartment. So I've seen it in the water and along the edges of the kind of pond that I have in my backyard. And then there's also otters and then also herons. And there's a variety of other organisms that also utilize mussels of all different species as a food source. Additionally, they're very important for stream and river stability. Mussel beds often provide a habitat for macroinvertebrates. When I say macroinvertebrates, I'm talking about either crayfish, something that doesn't have a vertebrae spine. We're looking at, larval stages of potentially terrestrial insects or aquatic insects. But mussel beds make excellent hiding places to help those macroinvertebrates avoid predation by fish, of ducks, other type of organisms that would like to use them as their snack or lunch. And so one thing is that mussels are filter feeders. In order for them to eat their lunch, they will suck in water from the water body that they are in, filter it for the nutrients and the food that they want, and then put the water back out into their environment. And so they can recycle and store nutrients, which in many cases can modify food webs. And I'll touch on it a little bit later when I talk about the invasive zebra mussels, but filter feeding is great. But when it comes from an invasive species, it can be extremely detrimental. But these native mussels are able to help keep food webs stable, modify them to create a healthier lake or stream ecosystem, and those kinds of things. Additionally, their shell formation. The interesting thing is that they can sequester atmospheric carbon. So some of you may know that there is an abundance of atmospheric carbon now from the burning of fossil fuels, many other things. And so these shells are able to sequester that atmospheric carbon. So these freshwater mussel species are key to helping to kind of reduce the amount of atmospheric carbon we have. And additionally, shells can incorporate heavy metals. So when there's a large pollution event or even a small one in their ecosystem in a lake or in a river, creek, stream, they serve as a record keeper. You're able to tell when there was a large pollution event because you'll be able to see it in evidence in their shells. And so they'll be able to say, you'll be able to determine when a pollution event happened in their habitat based on that, since they do incorporate those heavy metals into their shells. So I'm going to move into the threats to native mussels. Unfortunately, native mussels are quite threatened, and there's a lot of things that we need to keep in mind when we're doing conservation. But when it comes to the threats to native mussels, almost 70% of North American mussels are imperiled or endangered. And that's a lot, especially if you remember back to that introductory slide, that North America is home to over a third of the worldwide population of species for freshwater mussels. So if 70% of the North American mussels are imperiled, that's a lot of freshwater mussel species that are not stable, aren't reproducing, not having enough habitat, all of those things. And so within Michigan, 18 species are legally protected that are either endangered or threatened, and 6 of those species are federally listed as endangered and have federal protections against them or for them. And so an additional 12 species are listed as a special concern. And so I'll reiterate again, 70% is an extremely large amount for there to be imperiled mussels, which is why conservation of mussels and sharing with the public, like all of you, about mussels and their importance is crucial for their conservation. One thing that you may not know is that mussels make money in more than one way. And so one of the first things that I'll talk about is the button industry. And so back in the 1800s, early 1900s, circles were drilled out of the shells to make buttons. people would go in, collect large amounts of mussels, and some of you may see that in the previous picture that I showed where I had that white cat's paw, the inside of the mussel is that pearly white, shiny, very beautiful inside. And so that was used to make buttons. On the picture on the bottom right here, you can see how there's holes drilled out of these shells, and they would use those mussels to create buttons. And you can see in the upper picture there of the kind of Dremel that they used to punch them out. And so eventually this industry did decline in the mid 1900s, about 1940s, 1950s, with the invention of plastic buttons. However, in many areas in the United States and in the Midwest, you can still find shells like the one pictured on the bottom right there that have holes in them from when button making was utilized primarily freshwater mussels. Additionally, larger freshwater mussel shells were made into beads. And so these were shipped to Japan to be used to seed pearl oysters. And for those of you that don't know, pearl oysters are oysters that create pearls for the kind of international pearl trade. And so many times they will need to seed a pearl oyster in order for it to create pearls. The way a pearl is formed is some sort of foreign body is introduced, either naturally or in this case by humans, into the inside of an oyster. And then the oyster, to protect itself, will put layers and layers around that foreign body, creating that pearl that we now wear as jewelry and that we see as kind of a fine, almost gemstone of a way, kind of a saltwater gemstone. And so a lot of the larger shells, those beads are made from them, shipped off, and used as seeds for pearl oysters to create pearls to help foster that pearl trade. But unfortunately, the combination of the button industry and then also the seeded pearl oyster industry led to an abundance of overharvesting, not only in Michigan, but throughout North America, which led to a decline in mussel populations that we still see. But unfortunately, this decline in mussel populations wasn't really noticed or registered until the 1970s, which is really unfortunate since they had been overharvested for decades, almost 100 years at that point. And another threat to them, besides the button making and being used as seeds for pearl oysters, is their threats to habitat. And so my personal thesis research discusses dams and impoundments and reservoirs and how that impacts the spread of invasive species. But channel modification by damming, dredging, channelization can be very detrimental to freshwater mussel populations by changing their habitat, or in a lot of cases, completely removing the habitat they would need in order to have a healthy population. I will show a picture here on the right that shows from the EPA a stream bank that has had a retaining wall put against it. And so this basically eliminates part of the stream bank that would lead into the water and that may have been home to freshwater mussels. But now that there's that retaining wall, that habitat has been changed, likely permanently, and so it may no longer be suitable for those freshwater mussels. Wetland loss and hydraulic changes for the watershed, so altering of flow regimes, drainage of wetlands, many of those other things. Since those that you don't know, wetlands are very, very important to being water purifiers and cleaning the water before it gets into streams and lakes. So wetland loss can lead to higher water pollution and sedimentation. And so in the picture I show here, it is quite an urban stream, but you see that there's pollution in there, and pollution and sedimentation are quite detrimental to those freshwater mussels. Just in general, from the pollution, from toxins, chemicals that can hurt or kill the freshwater mussels, or sedimentation that can cause it difficult for them to filter feed or bury them, all of which, again, hurt and are threats to those freshwater mussels. And I told you once again that it would come back again, is the host fish. When we're building dams or removing dams and we are altering flow regimes, altering the courses of rivers and streams and lake connections, a lot of times, while we may not directly be impacting an actual mussel, you're not physically moving or killing a mussel, you're removing the habitat that's needed for host fish. And like I said, mussel populations are reliant upon the populations of their host fish. So if you lose the habitat that your host fish needs to survive and reproduce and keep a healthy population for the fish, it's going to be detrimental to mussel populations. And so if you're sampling for mussels and you see that, oh, there's still a population of this freshwater mussel in this stream, but they're all adults and you don't see any juveniles, this may be indication that the host fish is no longer there. And so yes, there's adults there, but they're not able to reproduce and to continue to build that population, replace the mussels that die off, and to create a larger population. So again, host fish are extremely critical. And so I included the life cycle from the previous slides, but also on the upper right-hand corner there, you see that that is just a quick image of what it looks like for those Glaucidia to be on the gills. And so they're in there, stay there until they become juvenile mussels and then fall off again. To reiterate, host fish, extremely important to the not only the biodiversity of freshwater mussels, but just for the sustaining of their populations. And so I mentioned about invasive mussels. My research focuses on the invasive zebra mussel, but these are 3 different invasive mussels that are in Michigan and in parts of North America. The first is the Asian clam, which is pictured down here on the left, kind of a circular clam, round. And so these are invasive. They are very similar and related to a native version, but these are specifically invasive. Then we have the zebra mussel, Dracaena polymorpha is its scientific name, which is what my research focuses on, and they look like this. However, it is not the large mussel that you see, rather all those little zebra-looking mussels with those zebra-looking markings on them that have attached themselves to this adult mussel. That's the zebra mussel. And this is one of the reasons why they're quite detrimental to freshwater populations. And thirdly, a close relative to the zebra mussel is the quagga mussel. And so we can see that here, they're fairly similar in size and shape in general, and are also extremely prolific filter feeders, similar to their zebra mussel friends. And so since my research is about invasive zebra mussel, I couldn't resist putting a slide in about them. And so the invasive zebra mussel was found in the Great Lakes in the 1980s. It's thought that it was brought to the Great Lakes through ballast water, through the shipping trade, the canal system through the Great Lakes. But there is evidence that they were potentially in the Great Lakes earlier than the 1980s, but it is well acknowledged that the 1980s is when they were firmly established. And so invasive zebra mussels prefer hard, stable substrate to attach to. Well, something that is hard and stable is existing freshwater mussels, as is that picture that I showed on the previous slide. They will often attach to freshwater mussels, either starving them by out filter feeding them, as the prolific filter feeder bullet point there says, or they will create it so that they are not able to reproduce since they are not able to open up. They're also not able to feed if they cannot open. So zebra mussel populations can basically stifle native species by attaching to them, basically starving them by stripping the water of nutrients needed for other organisms, including those freshwater mussels. And quagga mussels, their close relationship, has the same thing, being prolific filter feeders, attaching to native mussels, and are extremely detrimental to the native mussels. We seen in the Great Lakes that after the introduction of zebra mussels into the Great Lakes, we saw the Great Lakes get extremely, extremely clear. Some people think that's great. It's actually stripping a lot of the nutrients from the Great Lakes, creating it very difficult for other organisms to survive on what's left. And so finally, something a little less doom and gloom is the conservation of freshwater mussels. And the conservation of freshwater mussels has been slowly making improvements over the past years to not only preserve existing freshwater mussels, but also make sure that we're setting up foundations for future preservation and conservation of freshwater mussels, not only in Michigan, but throughout the United States and North America. And a couple key things that I want to make note is that in Michigan, there are protections for freshwater mussels from harvesting. So as you are out on your lakes, going through streams, creeks, it is very fine for you to pick them up, look at them. However, make sure you put them back down in the exact same spot in the same way that you found them. it is illegal to harvest them and take them with you, though some harvesting can be done if you apply for the correct permits. But conservation efforts have created these protections from harvesting to make sure that the mussels that are there are able to sustain the population, reproduce, and so that we aren't losing a bunch of mussels from over harvesting, as we saw when we had the button trade with the harvesting of mussels to create the buttons and for the seed pearls. Additionally, a lot of conservation efforts, though not focused on freshwater mussels, have been focused on improving the water quality of lakes and streams throughout the United States and in Michigan. This improved water quality is extremely helpful for freshwater mussels. If we're improving water quality, we're reducing the number of pollutants, we're reducing the eutrophication or the high nutrient loading in a lake or stream, which can help improve this water quality and help create healthy water for our freshwater mussels to be in. And then some exciting stuff is that lab propagation is proving to be successful. There have been reintroductions into watersheds in Ohio and Pennsylvania of freshwater mussels that were originally there but had disappeared due to habitat loss, harvesting, bad water quality. And so they were propagated in a lab and reintroduced into watersheds. This is extremely promising for Michigan and all over North America, that in areas where there used to be freshwater mussel species, but are no longer, if we're able to rebuild and restore that habitat, there's a chance we can reintroduce these freshwater mussels back to their native ranges and help kind of bolster and boost up that population of mussels, which in turn can help boost water quality even more and help maintain healthy ecosystems in streams and lakes. The other thing is the removal of old dams and replacement of undersized culverts. So over the past many years, the removal of dams has been kind of speeding up. I believe about 90% of the dams in the United States are over 100 years old. It was back in the early 1900s when a lot of these were built, during the Great Depression, kind of bolstering, providing jobs to, feed America, basically. Well, a lot of those dams are old and unstable, not safe. And so removal of these, while very good, has to be done carefully, taking into consideration that while removing the dam can open up a previously unconnected, in a way, stream system, you have to be careful when you're removing these so you're not introducing contaminants that were in those dams, making sure you're not creating too much sediment loading in the water for that sedimentation that can hurt freshwater mussels. But when you remove those dams, you're able to reconnect two sections of a river. You can reconnect lakes, which allows for those host fish, again, it came back again, that reconnecting those water systems can allow the host fish to now go back and forth and to potentially have more habitat for them, which can lead to a higher population of freshwater mussels if they have that host fish that they need. Additionally, replacing undersized culverts. So when you have a road that is kind of breaking up a stream channel or a stream section, having a culvert that is too small. And by culvert, for those of you that don't know what it is, I didn't know that was the actual name for them. It's the tube that kind of goes underneath the road. And there are several different versions of it. But creating a larger culvert allows the fish to go through, higher water flow. And again, connecting that habitat so that the mussels and the freshwater fish that go with them are able to have habitat that's suitable for their reproduction and to sustain a healthy population. And finally, I want to do a quick kind of shout out to Renee Mulcrone and Joseph Rathburn and their Pocket Field Guide to Freshwater Mussels. It is an excellent resource for Michigan mussels and was used as partially the basis for this presentation and this talk. And so in this kind of pocket field guide illustrates a lot of the identification for native mussels in Michigan, as well as a lot of the background that I went over in the beginning of my slides. And Michigan mussels, all 43 of them, are extremely important for our ecosystems and for lakes and streams and all of the aquatic systems that we have, not only in Michigan, but in North America and around the world. And it's extremely important to make sure that we're keeping freshwater mussels, even though they're very well hidden sometimes with their patchy distribution, keep them in mind as we're doing freshwater conservation work and sampling and all of these other things, since they are so crucial to our freshwater systems. And with that, I want to thank you all for listening. I thoroughly enjoyed discussing freshwater mussels with you guys, and am very much open to any questions. My contact information is also listed here if you think of something after the fact. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Danielle. I just put in the chat a link if you're interested in that cool mussel poster that you showed. If folks wanted to get one of them for their own home or cottage, you can find one there. I did turn the chat back on here in a sec. We're going to turn that on. But if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A box. I've had a few come in, so I think without further ado, I'm going to pose a few questions to Danielle when she has a drink of water and gets her voice, because she's been talking for a while. All right, so here's a two-part question from one of our listeners. One, how can you tell the difference between a zebra and a quagga mussel? And two, what is the difference between a clam and a mussel, or is there one?
So for that first question, difference between a zebra mussel and a quagga mussel. Let me see if I can go back to the pictures that I had of them. Back a few slides. So zebra mussels, as you can see on the images here, have that kind of zigzaggy image kind of pattern on them. And that's one of the identifying things for zebra versus quagga mussels. Quagga mussels also have stripes on them, but they're much less distinctive. And that is the way I learned how to identify them, as well as zebra mussels are much more, as you can see here, kind of that very sharp triangular shape with that one flat edge. Quagga mussels are similar, however, they're a little bit more rounded and their markings are much less zebra-like. So that's kind of the way I would describe that. As for the second question, which I believe was the clams versus mussels, biologically, I'm not too certain whether there's a specific difference. When I was in undergrad, I used clam, bivalve, mussel, mollusk, all of those interchangeably through common language of just discussing it. Scientifically, I believe clams are typically marine or saltwater organisms. And mollusks can be freshwater or marine. So the zebra mussel is originally from Eurasia, is able to survive in both marine environments as well as freshwater environments. So it's a mussel and it's found in both areas. I hope that answers that question a little bit.
Great, thanks, Danielle. Another question that came in from one of our stream monitoring volunteers who's active in the MyCore program. And, they described how they collect invertebrates from the stream bed using a net and kicking around on the stream bottom. And sometimes they get mussels in their nets. What should they do if they end up with mussels in their nets?
Yeah, so first thing I would recommend is take a picture of it. Maybe you can identify it later on, and that might help be able to identify what kind of mussels are in the streams that you're sampling. But the main thing is to make sure that you put that mussel back in the water. Don't leave it out. Don't take it with you. The other thing is to try to kind of nestle it into the dirt, or not dirt, but substrate a little bit with the kind of hinge side, as a way to describe it, facing down. That way it can open up from the substrate to filter feed. If you're not confident about your abilities to nestle it back into substrate, simply setting it back where you found it in that same stream section, as close to where you got it from, is kind of that best practice. That way you aren't moving it to an area that may not be suitable. So if you get one in one stream section and you put it 10 feet down the stream, that 10 feet can make a difference as to what that substrate is like. So again, right where you find it, if you can remember where you found it, that's where you want to put it.
Great answer, Danielle. And I'll add on to that from a MyCore perspective. Our typical invertebrate sampling protocol suggests that you keep the invertebrates that you collect for later identification and as vouchers. We preserve them in alcohol and so forth. We make an exception for native mussels. If you encounter native mussels, following Danielle's advice for replacing them back where you found them is what we advise. All right, got a lot of questions coming in here. Let's see. Is there a limit to the size of the stream for mussels? I'm interested if mussels can be found in small headwater streams, maybe 2 to 3 feet wide, less than 1 to 2 feet deep.
Good question. I am not entirely sure. There may be a specific species that is able to survive in that habitat. However, off the top of my head, I don't have a specific answer for that. There's a chance if there's other suitable habitat, if that stream is year round, it's a permanent water body, there's a chance that there might be.
All right, thanks, Danielle. I'll remind people, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A and not in the chat. We're looking in the Q&A for questions. Here's another question related to zebra mussels. What's the evidence for earlier zebra mussel occurrence in North America? Do you have any insight on that?
So yeah, it's super interesting. And so I've done a little bit of research, not my specific research. I've done a little bit of reading into some of the literature that suggests that there may have been an earlier introduction. And so basically they were able to do, I believe it's like genetic sequencing of, I don't know what the exact, I'm not a geneticist, so I don't know the names for all of these things, but there is some evidence that there's the potential they were introduced earlier using some sort of sequencing from water samples and from zebra mussel like shells that they found that were deceased, that sort of thing. I don't know the specifics of how they did it, but I know that's in part a little bit of what they did.
Interesting. All right. One thing, there's a question that came in and it's about a topic that I know is really fascinating, is that reproductive cycle with the host fish and the glochidia that are released and attached to those gills. And one of our listeners wants to know, do those glochidia irritate the fish? Is there any kind of negative impact on their host fish?
From my reading and understanding, typically not. There is actually some evidence that this parasitic phase actually protects that fish from other parasites that may want to attach to the gills, simply because there's no more room if those glochidia are on there. And it can help kind of strengthen that host fish or host fish species resistance to other parasites. I have not read any negative effects. Rather, it's a symbiotic relationship. So that is where, both parties, or at least one party, benefits from that relationship.
All right, thank you. Lots of questions coming in about zebra mussels. I don't know if we'll get to all of them, but I'll ask a couple. This listener says, I might have missed you saying this, but has it been discovered why zebra mussels survive by attaching to other mussels?
So it's not that they specifically will attach to other mussels. It's the second bullet point here on the slide that I just brought up, is that they prefer hard, stable substrate. And some freshwater mussels, once they're adults, they don't move. They stay in the same area. It's not for all species, but some species do. So the shells of those freshwater mussels are hard. And if they're the kind of species that doesn't move around, they're quite stable. And so it's simply that they're not necessarily targeting freshwater mussels. It's just that they happen to make up the kind of substrate that they like to attach to.
All right. We're going to go more broadly now into lakes. A person asks, we have sedimentation in our canals and on our lake. So there's sedimentation in the canals on their lake, and they're considering dredging those canals. Sounds like both can be a problem for mussels, both the sedimentation and the dredging. Are there guidelines for dredging that can have the least effect on mussels?
So I'm not super informed on the specifics of guidelines, but in many cases when there's dredging occurring, removal of dams, there's a lot of regulations that have been developed or are being developed to make sure that they're removing any mussels that they find doing the dredging, doing that sort of thing for remediation, or whether it's they need to deepen the channel for navigation or something, and either putting those mussels back or moving those mussels to a similar ecosystem that that species has been known to survive in. There is a lot more specifics and nuances to that, a lot more politics and policies that go into that, many of which I believe can be found on the Michigan DNR website. There's some regulations that are listed publicly there.
Right, absolutely. Great answer, Danielle. And I think another thing that I would mention along those lines is that if you're planning a project, a dredging project, or other projects that may require disturbance of the bed, the lake bottom, stream bed, that kind of thing, it can be a good idea to do a survey of mussels there to see if you may be in an area that would be disturbing the habitat of mussels that are there. Because they tend to be one of those groups that don't get a lot of attention or notice because you don't really see them very easily unless you're looking for them. So I'm glad folks are thinking about it. Staying in lakes, Danielle, do you have any more details or information about endangered mussel species that live in Michigan's lakes?
I do, a little bit. So the pocket guide that I mentioned, so I have a hard copy of it here, and it lists many of the kind of endangered species that are in freshwater mussels. However, I believe the Michigan DNR, as well as like the USGS with their endangered species database, can kind of identify the endangered species there. And both of those websites, I believe, have ways to identify those mussels in your lakes or streams as well.
All right, thank you. All right, questions keep coming in. We've had a couple that connect zebra mussels and algae blooms. For example, here's one that specifically says, can you discuss in more detail the impact that zebra mussels has had on aquatic environments, especially as they relate to algal blooms?
Yeah, so I definitely can. I won't get too in depth, so we have time for more questions. But basically, there has been links to harmful algal blooms and this prolific filter feeding of zebra mussels and in turn quagga mussels. So I don't know if any of you have heard of microcystin, that toxin that has also been tied to these algal blooms from that blue-green algae. Basically, zebra mussels, they're also, besides being prolific, are also preferential. They're picky eaters. And so what they will do is they will intake their water to filter feed, take out all the goodies that they want, and then spit back out what they don't want. And a lot of times that is microcystin. And so with these harmful algal blooms, you can kind of get this abundance of microcystin building up in the water, which is just a very brief general way to describe kind of what happens. But yes, you can have these harmful algal blooms that can cause sickness in fish, pets, humans. That's why a lot of times during the summers, you'll see, signs along lakes that if it's green, don't go in because of those harmful algal blooms. Hopefully that answered that question a little bit.
Absolutely. It actually answered a few people's questions. That one came up a lot. On the flip side, though, related, do you know if has it ever been documented that a bad algae bloom could actually hurt the mussels, like hinder native mussels that are living in a water body?
I personally don't know the specifics of that. I do know that if there is that accumulation of microcystin, that potentially could hurt the native species and actually can form what's called bioaccumulation. So if it is absorbed into the body tissue of mussels, of fish, as other fish predate upon those mussels and fish, and it goes up through the food web to the fish that us humans eat, we can get sick sometimes from eating that. So not directly answering the question, but it can in turn, I believe, have some impact on native species, though I don't know the specifics of it.
Understood. Yeah, great. And I'll mention to folks that we do have several folks from DNR and Eagle in the audience today, and they've been helpfully adding some information about dredging projects and permits and all that stuff, and also addressing some of the other questions in the chat. So take advantage of that and take a look at the chat, folks, if there's a bit more information there. Obviously, the topic of mussels is very, very broad, and so we'll do the best we can between our guest speaker and our audience members to get you answers while we're here today. We've got about 10 more minutes. And so I'm going to look at a couple other questions that have come in. If you were to speak to a waterfront homeowner, a lakefront homeowner, or streamfront homeowner, what would you say to them as an individual? What could they do personally to help protect the native mussels that may be found in habitat near their own property?
Yeah, that's excellent. So I actually have family members that are lakefront owners, and we found mussels off the side of their docks. And one thing that I told even my family members is that if you find the mussels, don't move them. Do your best to avoid disturbing them. If it's in your lake, but not necessarily on your property or on your section of lake, talk to the other people, your neighbors, if there's other people that are living on your lake or stream, about making sure that they're not moving them. If you're doing stream walks where you're walking through the streams, to avoid those areas. And the best kind of arsenal I can recommend is making people aware that they are there. And also making them aware of the fact that it's illegal to take them, you want to leave them there. So that they are able to help maintain that ecosystem. So those are kind of in general, recommendations I would give.
All right, thanks. Here's a great one. I love this one. What's your favorite mussel and why?
That's tricky. Personally, I think I have it on a previous slide here. Go all the way back. So it's a little bean of a mussel. I think it's absolutely adorable. Oh, there it was. This rayed bean, I think they're absolutely adorable. They're so little. They're like this big, as you can see by the size scale for the image there. I think they're really cute. The little mussels, I think they're adorable. But also white cat's paw. There's a reason these two were in the slides. I think they look kind of funny with their little knob on one side. I would say those are my favorite, but I'm also not, exposed. I have never been exposed to all of the freshwater mussels in Michigan. So of the ones that I've seen or of the ones that I've researched or looked into a little bit, these are also, like I mentioned, they're imperiled or endangered, but I don't know. I like all mussels. They're kind of cute.
Yeah, they really are. And I love the names, right? There's some really great common names for our freshwater mussels.
Yep. There's a wide variety of names, everything from, the rayed bean to the pimpleback to the doe foot, I believe is one of them. Fluted shell. The names are quite fun.
We've had a couple questions come in about how long native mussels live. Do you have any information on that? There's some suggestion that some might be quite long-lived.
Yeah, so it can vary by species, as with kind of the way that organisms go, but they can live decades long. So, if you find a very large mussel, it's not always indicative. If it's a smaller species, you aren't going to find a mussel the size of your fist if the species only gets to be 2 inches long. But in some cases, you can see kind of those rings and the growth rings in the image that I have back here. You see growth rings is kind of down here on that bottom right of that morphology image. And so those growth rings can help you tell how old that mussel is. I don't know what the oldest mussel was recorded. That would be a very interesting fun fact, but that's how you can kind of tell, but they can live to be quite old, decades at the very least. In some cases.
Absolutely. And in fact, the pocket guide book that you mentioned, one of the authors, Joe Rathbun, he's in the audience today, and he just typed in the Q&A that they can be up to 180 years old. Isn't that amazing? Yep. To think about that some little clam that you run across in a river could have been in that water body for so long. It's pretty amazing. And it also kind of gets at the importance of keeping habitat and water quality good over a long period of time for them to really, meet their lifespan, which is really kind of mind-blowing, isn't it? All right, back to the reproduction. You started to talk a little bit about this, but there's also some folks that are really interested on more. Are there certain species of host fish that the mussels connect to? Is that a specific relationship between a particular mussel and a particular fish species, or how specific is that relationship?
It depends on the species. I know that seems to be the answer for a lot of it, but some species have several fish that they can use as host fish. Some even use salamanders, but in general, it's typically a fish. Some species can only use one, maybe two species of fish. So if that fish species is not there, they're not able to reproduce. So it varies by species, but some can use several different host fish. Others are very specific to a singular species of fish.
Great, thank you. Thank you. We have had a couple people ask about getting a copy of the pocket guide. And I know I've spoken with Joe about that recently. And Joe, if you have insight on that, feel free to comment. But I would also say, I know we do have an example of the PDF version of that. And we could actually, we're going to post the recording of this webinar, and we could post a copy of the PDF there for people to access it. Let's see, we've got just a couple more minutes. So I'm going to look for, oh gosh, I know we're not going to get to everyone's questions. So Danielle, maybe if you want to scroll back to your contact information on that last slide, if people want to follow up with you. I'm looking for another kind of popular theme here. Let's see. We've had a couple of questions related to native mussel restoration after, habitat damage has happened or after zebra mussels have come in. Could you say anything about like reintroduction of native mussels into an area? Especially, can mussels be farm raised or raised in a hatchery and reintroduced? And if that is possible, or transplanted, and if your lake has zebra mussels in it, should you bother?
So for the second half of that question of zebra mussels and should you bother, it's going to depend on the lake. It's going to depend on the ecosystem. But for the first half of that question about, kind of lab growth of mussels and kind of reintroducing them into ecosystems, it has been done. It's been done in Ohio and Pennsylvania. I believe it also has been done in North Carolina, or they were planning on doing it in parts of North Carolina. So it has been done. I do not know the results of how well those populations maintained, but it's been done. So some species are able to be raised in a lab setting or in a hatchery setting. Again, a key thing with that is having that host fish. So it's not just raising that mussel, you also have to raise the host fish that goes along with it, which can make it quite intensive because you need to have habitat that's suitable for both within your hatchery or your lab. It has been done. I do not know the extent of how well it is done, as well as how sustainable that process is. So the inputs of the cost effectiveness, all of those things.
All right, Danielle, thank you so much. I wanted to wrap up with a couple of comments. I did just put in the chat, one of the co-authors of the Pocket Guide, Joe Rathbun, provided his email address. So if you're interested in getting a copy of that, refer to the chat, rathbunj@sbcglobal.net. You can contact him and he will do his best to get you connected with a copy of that Pocket Guide. I know I have a couple copies myself, and it is a really, really fun, interesting reference specific to Michigan, which is great. I also wanted to remind folks that this was recorded. This will be, once we clean up the recording and it gives us a little time, maybe give us a week or so, we will post it on the same page you went to register at mycore.net. Visit there, and under the description of Danielle's presentation, a link to the recording will appear in about 1 week. I also wanted to remind folks that this is just the first of a series of webinars that were organized by Danielle primarily, so we thank her for that as well. Our next one will be on the next several Mondays, and the next one next week we'll be hearing about stream ecosystems, how they work, how humans have changed them, and how we can restore them. So I hope y'all can join us for that one as well, and check out our website for the whole lineup. When you leave today, you'll be sent to a quick evaluation survey. We love to get your feedback. We really appreciate that. And again, thank you so much. We really appreciate it. And above all, thank you, Danielle.
Of course, thank you, everyone.
All right. Thanks, everyone.